We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma atque semper Virgo Felix Steli porta
Sum mens in lodame Gabrieli sore funda nos in pace mutans nomen
And welcome everybody, Steve with Sensus Fidelium coming out with the third installment on our series on the councils of the church, going with the second and third councils of Constantinople. So get your popcorn ready for this one, ladies and gents. I think there's a lot of information, as Dr. Allen was talking about to me off camera. Notes will not be given to you. You have to do it on your own. Dr. Allen, how you doing, bud?
Hello, I'm doing well, thank you very much.
Welcome. How's things with you guys?
Oh, a little bit of cabin fever, but it's relative, domestic bliss with the odd outbreak of cabin fever.
Dr. Fimister risked life and limb to get the books for this episode, so please, your undivided attention.
Okay, the Second Council of Constantinople was held in 553, about 100 years after the Council of Chalcedon, the previous Ecumenical Council, which was held in 451, but went on for a few years. And then the Third Council of Constantinople was held in 680 to 681, 130 years or so after the one before that. They're a bit complicated, so don't switch off. A lot of people, I think the first thing to say really is that a lot of people think of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, Chalcedon, as if it sort of is the end of the story, a bit like the Return of the Jedi. And then it turns out, Emperor Palpatine's still alive, and the Empire has been restored as the First Order.
I feel like Captain America and Avengers. I got that reference.
In fact, the Chalcedon didn't really end it all at all. I mean, it kind of just opened it all up again. But a lot of histories of the early church will sort of end in 451, which must be really irritating if you're Egyptian, because the fact that it didn't end is a very, very significant part of the history of Egypt. I think one of the reasons the Westerners, in the narrow sense of people from Latin civilization rather than Greek, one of the reasons Westerners in that sense tend to think of it as being over is because it wasn't such a big deal for us in the first place. We were kind of like, oh no, there's another huge explosion of theological controversy on the other side of the Adriatic among those Greeks, and the Pope's written them a letter explaining how it all works, and they've read it out, and they all cheered, and that's the end of that. So in a way, that was kind of Western attitude. We didn't really have all the dynamics and politics and stuff that we discussed last time didn't impact so much in the West. We thought that we always just understood it and they didn't, but we told them and now it's okay. The other reason is the Protestants, why this kind of mirage that all ended in 451, all these controversies about our Lord's nature ended in 451 came about, is because a lot of the more sane-ish mainstream, in the old sense of mainstream Protestant, not in the new sense of not believing in anything at all and having women clerics and gay marriage and stuff. I mean mainstream in the old sense of not not being completely wild and wonderful sectarians who don't believe in the Trinity and all that kind of thing.
A little splash of Catholicism still in there.
Right, yes, yeah. They generally hold to the first 4 ecumenical councils, right, up to Chalcedon. Some of the very sort of would-be Catholic ones actually hold to, or usually factions within more conservative Protestant denominations, like the Anglo-Catholics in the Church of England, who like to dress up and pretend that they're Catholics and worship bits of bread. They might adhere to the first 7 ecumenical councils like the Orthodox do, but usually more conservative, well-informed Protestants will just adhere to the first 4 ecumenical councils up to Chalcedon. So that's another reason why it's often seen as the end of the story, because those Protestants are not so interested in what happened afterwards, and so there's less market for a book ending in 681 compared to a book ending in 451, and as it's fiendishly complicated and difficult, again, don't switch off, there's a strong incentive both in terms of sales and in terms of the hassle to just call it a day in 451 and pretend that it was all over and we can all go home. Just like a lot of people don't watch the prequels or the sequels, they just watch the original trilogy. Anyway, so again, don't switch off. Right, yes. So what happened? Well, 2 things happened. The first thing is to understand the context of what happened in the 100 years between the 4th and the 5th Ecumenical Council, between Chalcedon and Constantinople II. There are 2 big contextual things to understand that happened. One is that the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed. It was a complete nightmare, and it was horrible for centuries in the Latin-speaking parts of the Mediterranean world. And it sort of remained horrible on the southern side of the Mediterranean, because they ended up being conquered by the Muslims. And but I mean, it eventually got better on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, but it took many centuries. And that was already kind of going on while Chalcedon was going on. Attila the Hun was charging all over Western Europe with desperate Romans with fewer and fewer troops and less money, desperately trying to hold the whole thing together. And in fact, they won a victory in Gaul while the Council of Chalcedon was going on, which looked like it, yay, a victory. But I mean, they kind of, there's this guy called Aetius, who sometimes gets called the last of the Romans, who was sort of desperately running around hiring one barbarian tribe in order to fight against another barbarian tribe. And but when he'd won his victory, there were no Roman soldiers left and there was no money left, so it was kind of completely empty victory. There was nowhere to go from that point. In fact, they were so desperate in the western half of the Roman Empire that they used to not fully go into the kill in these battles, because they didn't want to completely wipe out one set of barbarians in case the barbarians they'd hired to do it turned on them. So they needed to keep a residuum of the barbarians they defeated, so they could hire them to fight against the barbarians who were fighting for them in that battle. So it was desperate. Now, so very quickly, obviously this is only kind of contextual important for church history, but to explain roughly what had happened, I mean, because you've got to understand that the first 3 councils, and to some extent the first 4 councils, were happening in the context of an empire which enclosed the whole of what we now think of as Western civilization, the entire Mediterranean world. I mean, these kind of estimates about population are difficult, but some people would argue that we're talking about a quarter of the population of the world that lived under the same government for 500 years. And so, I mean, it was their entire world, and it felt like it was going to last forever. And then suddenly, in the 5th century, it didn't. Half of it fell off a cliff and disappeared forever. So, I mean, it was kind of complacency which brought them down in the end. I mean, the Romans had always had this. The empire was structured around the army. There were a lot of people from recently conquered provinces who wanted to get citizenship, and they would join the army in order to get citizenship. And after 20-something years, you could retire with a nice plot of land in a different part of the empire from where you were from, and probably some sort of lump sum or whatever. And you would have been thoroughly Romanized through your time in the army. And that was a kind of way of churning the population around the empire. You Romanize them, you turn them into hardened soldiers, and then you plonk them on some kind of estate on thousands of miles from where they come from originally, and everyone slowly becomes Romans. And in fact, over the course of Roman history, from the 1st century BC, well, obviously it goes much further than that, but I mean, it would become Mediterranean spanning in the 1st century BC up until the time of the Council of Nicaea. They'd slowly come to have this sense, not so much of the Romans being a bunch of people who've conquered the world and who we have to do as we're told when they tell us what to do. It's this sense of us all being Romans. So they start using this term Romania to just mean the territory that all the Romans live in. And even Saint Athanasius, in fact, he's one of the earlier sources for the use of this term Romania to mean the whole Roman world, as if it was like a country. And they used to call the Mediterranean RC, not RC in the sense of Roman Catholic, but our sea, meaning like the pool in the middle of our garden. Right, so that's what it was, but from 117 onwards, they didn't conquer any more provinces, and in 202 they granted citizenship to anyone born in the Roman Empire who wasn't a slave. And so slowly, all the incentive for joining the army began to sort of drain away, and more they started having to recruit people from across the frontiers of the empire, more and more Germans, because they never quite squished Germany. It all went a bit wrong in the reign of the first emperor. There was a disastrous military reverse, and they got their fingers burnt, and they sort of chastised them every now and again, but they kind of left the border on the Rhine River. But the Germans were being recruited into the army because people weren't so interested in joining inside the Roman Empire, and that was okay. They were being Romanized, but the more and more you recruited them into the army, the more bigger a job it was to Romanize them, because the more people who were already in the army were already the descendants of German barbarians, and of course they also, because if you keep expanding, then the people on the edge of the frontier will be proper barbarians, howling, waving their spears and smashing them against their shields, and looking beardy and not very civilized, and basically scary, but not as scary as Romans. The Romans were in the 1st century, they were. It was this is a caricature, but it was as if they had machine guns and the other guys had sharpened bits of fruit, and basically they were okay. There was no chance of the barbarians winning. But once you just sort of settle on the frontier, then slowly the other guys on the other side are going to start getting closer and closer to your level of military technology and tactics and strategy and stuff, and before you know it, there's an improvised explosive device underneath your Roman tank. Obviously, slight anachronism there, but anyway. Yes. So the gap was reducing, and on the Roman side of the frontier, the army was becoming more and more Germanized, and Saint Jerome points out that this is essentially prophesied in the prophet Daniel, where the Roman Empire is depicted as the iron legs of the great idol of temporal power, and slowly those iron legs begin to mingle with clay, and then they become entirely clay, so that the feet of the idol are just clay. And Saint Jerome says, well, that's the barbarians. We're mingling more and more with the barbarians until we're just going to become the barbarians. And the sort of chief minister of the Western Emperor at the time was a barbarian called Stilcio, and he was very offended. And but fortunately, Saint Jerome was hanging out in Bethlehem, so he couldn't do anything about it. And when the next volume of Saint Jerome's works came out, he alludes to this and says that people who were offended by his remarks about the clay should direct their complaints to the prophet Daniel and not to him. And
easy to say from how far away it was.
So as I say, the situation's getting more and more severe until eventually there kind of just isn't a Roman army anymore. There's just a bunch of barbarian tribes. It's become like McDonald's. There's a parent company based in Rome, and it sells franchises. You can be the Roman army for a certain amount of cash, and in this part of the empire.
I'm now picturing Ronald McDonald as Gladius Maximus Aurelius.
So eventually it doesn't work. I mean, several things happen in we talked last time about how Theodosius ended up as emperor because the previous emperor, who was an Arian, was killed in battle at the Battle of Adrianople. Well, that happened because in 376 a bunch of Gothic barbarians who were actually running away from the Huns. So it was the Huns, who were scarier barbarians, had turned up in what's now the Ukraine, and the Goths, who in those days lived in what's now the Ukraine, were terrified because they were much more scary barbarians than them. So they decided to emigrate to the Roman Empire and said, we can come and fight for you. And the Romans are like, well, why would we want you to fight for us when you're running away from the people that we would be asking you to fight? So the Romans they thought, well, we can't, they've all turned up with their wives and their kids and everything, and we can't just say go away because we don't have enough people on the frontier just to get rid of all of these Goths in one go. So we'll invite them in, offer them a big dinner party, and then poison the leaders at the dinner party, and then we can massacre them, and it'll be fine.
Everybody break.
Sorry?
1, 2, 3, break.
So the unfortunately, the kitchen staff decided this was a bit dishonourable and told some Goths that they were all going to be poisoned, and so the Goths obviously went nuts and rampaged throughout the Balkans, and that's how the Emperor Valens ended up being killed. But poor old Theodosius, I mean, he was sent over by Valens' nephews to try and deal with it, and he did deal with it, but it seems that it was kind of tricky. And it was more about kind of cutting off their supply lines and wearing them down and getting them to the negotiating table. It was no kind of big victory of the Romans against the Goths because he just didn't have enough actual Romans there in armour capable of fighting the battles necessary. So he kind of stabilised the situation. And then when he died in 395, if I remember rightly, he divided the empire between his two sons, Honorius and Arcadius. He put one of them in charge of the west and one of them in charge of the east, and that didn't sound like it was going to be a big permanent thing, because the empire had already 100 years beforehand been administratively divided into an eastern and a western zone, and that wasn't supposed to be a permanent. There's a lot of traffic back and forth between the two sides, and people would be emperor of one side and then take over the other side, and sometimes do civil war, sometimes not. And but in the end, it turned out to be it was never reunited. I mean, it was considered a single united empire, but they never. And the reason why is because although he temporarily fixed the problem of the Goths, he hadn't fixed the fundamental problem that there wasn't really a proper Roman army there anymore, and then historians think, on the 31st of December, 406, the Rhine froze. 31st of December. Yeah, sorry, I said December. The Rhine froze solid.
Oh wow!
Which was really bad because the Rhine and the Danube were the frontiers in Europe of the Roman Empire, and so they were rather relying on it not being solid. So it turning into a motorway was not a good idea from a Rome point of view, and the Vandals and the Alans, no relation, and the Swabi came pouring over the Rhine into Gaul, and anarchy ensued, and basically they never recovered. And one of the problems was, of course, you couldn't unlike now, we live in the happy days of massive government debt. The Romans couldn't just borrow loads of money in order to get them through the present crisis. And
wait, they had no Fed? They didn't have a printing press?
So if you lost control of a couple of provinces for more than 2 or 3 years, that's it. You've lost that money. You can't sustain as big an army because you don't have the resources from that province coming in. So if you don't undo the reverses within a few years, they become very difficult to ever reverse.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of anarchy that was consuming the Western Roman Empire at the time of the Council of Chalcedon, and the Eastern Roman Empire was better off. It was richer, because it was just a richer area. I mean, the Western Empire was much more colonial in the sense that the Romans had conquered areas that weren't urbanized. They built their own kind of new towns, and they were sort of, squatting on pre-existing non-urbanized culture, and that had developed over the centuries of Roman rule, but it was still not like the Greek half of the empire, which was much older than the Romans themselves and had been prosperous and terribly important for a very, very long time, very wealthy. So it was more resilient than the western half of the empire. They could afford to, hire more people to fight, and it was more built up. It was more difficult for an area just to revert to barbarism just under German barbarians instead of Celtic barbarians. So the Eastern Empire hung on, but the Western Empire was falling as the Council of Chalcedon was going on, and in fact by 476, so 100 years after the Goths had originally turned up on the Danube, Italy was being ruled by a barbarian general called Odoacer, who just had a bunch of puppet emperors who didn't really have any power. And in 476, he decided that this wasn't really worth the hassle, and he deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and he sent his regalia to Constantinople with a little bow tied around it, and said, "Look, if I'm going to be the nominal subject of an emperor, I might as well be the nominal subject of a real emperor in Constantinople as a pretend one in Rome or Ravenna or whatever."
That'd be fighting words.
Say again.
That's fighting words.
So he sent it across to the emperor in Constantinople. Now the emperor in Constantinople who's called Zeno, wasn't quite clear what to do about this, because he actually hadn't recognized this Romulus Augustulus guy, because there'd been so many coups and things in the West that he wasn't officially approving of the last Western emperor. He was officially recognizing the one beforehand, who was called Julius Nepos, who was living in exile in part of the East. And so Zeno writes back and says, well, excuse me, but actually your proper emperor is this Julius Nepos guy, so you should be recognizing him as emperor. And Odoacer's doesn't even bother to reply, and he just gets on with it. And then a few years later, in 480, Julius Nepos dies, and as they've completely lost control of the West anyway, the Eastern Emperor doesn't bother appointing a new pretend Western Emperor. So that's it. From 480 onwards, there's only one Roman Emperor, and he is and he's not seen as the Eastern Emperor, and the post of Western Emperor is vacant. He's seen as just the Emperor. Mm-hmm. So the idea now is that the parent company runs Roman Empire PLC, runs the eastern half of the empire directly, and then in the western half of the empire, the theory is, which most of the barbarians actually go along with, is that they are franchisees who run their different little regions of the Western Empire on franchise from the emperor in Constantinople. And partly this is because the empire's existed for 500 years, nobody knows anything else, so their idea of what it means to be a legitimate ruler is to be a Roman ruler. So you have to be in some way agreed to by the emperor in Constantinople, and the emperor in Constantinople, if he doesn't have the armies to take those provinces back, he's kind of, okay, well, we'll go along with that because it's less embarrassing than admitting that we've just lost half of the known world in a fit of inadvertence. So that's the weird situation. And of course, one of the shortly after Julius Nepos dies in 480. The emperor in Constantinople gets a bunch of Ostrogoths. So the Goths have now split into two groups: the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. And he gets a bunch of Ostrogoths led by a guy who'd been raised in Constantinople called Theodoric. He gets him to go and, but he's a Goth. He gets him to go and conquer Italy off Odoacer, which he does. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of takes over the franchise of Italy, but in a slightly more official way, approved by Constantinople. And so there's this funny period from the end of the 5th century until the 530s, so about 50 years, although it deteriorates at the end. But there's this funny period during which Italy is sort of being run with the approval of the emperor in Constantinople by this quite Romanized Goth. And he doesn't really want to do all the complicated things involving the government of a complicated urban civilization. So he just runs the military end of things, and he lives in Ravenna, which is the military HQ in the north of Italy, of the province of Italy. And he lets the old Roman senatorial families in Rome itself actually do all the kind of civilian government. And this is great for the old senatorial families, because they've been kind of pretend important people for hundreds of years. The army has been running everything for centuries and centuries in the Roman Empire, and the senatorial families are unbelievably wealthy, but they haven't really been very important politically, and the emperors haven't even lived at Rome for a very, very long time. So the senatorial families are suddenly actually running the show, and it's great. It's kind of like suddenly it's like the 1st century BC again. They're in charge, and they feel important, and so they're quite pleased. And it's quite nice for the popes because they're out of the reach of the emperors in Constantinople, so they can they're still officially part of the sphere of authorized the Roman world, but they're not quite within reach of the emperor in Constantinople, so the popes can kind of do whatever they like. And this is made a very important fact is that almost all of these barbarians are Arian heretics. Now the Roman population have abandoned Arianism long ago by this point, but the Goths and many of the other barbarians were missionized by a guy called Ulfilas, who was sort of half Gothic, half Roman Arian, and eventually it became a sort of badge of ethnic pride for the barbarians that they were Arians as opposed to the Romans, and so they didn't even, it wasn't a big theological thing, I think. By then it was just a sort of, my grandparents were Norwegian, so I'm a Lutheran, but your grandparents were Welsh, so you're a Methodist, whatever. I mean, so it wasn't, so they didn't, so these Goths didn't consort religiously with the Roman population in Italy, and they weren't directly involved in internal arguments among the Catholics about theology. So that they left the Pope alone, more or less, at least initially, and so he could get on with taking quite a strong line with any naughtiness from Constantinople, without the fear that imperial troops were going to turn up at his breakfast table the following morning and drag him off to the other side of the Mediterranean.
Swimming with the fishes.
Go on.
He'd be swimming with the fishes.
Absolutely, yes. They're less concerned about that than they might otherwise be. So that's the background in terms of the West, right? Now, in terms of the East, the second big contextual thing you have to understand is that the Council of Chalcedon was a complete disaster from the perspective of the East. It didn't end the story at all. Basically, what the Latins and what the sort of imperial authorities thought had happened at Chalcedon was that we've sorted out this business about one nature of the incarnate logos. We're saying now that he's one hypostasis in two natures, and it's all been sorted out, and Peter has spoken through the mouth of Leo, and everything's solved, and we hate Nestorius and we hate Eutyches, and they're both wrong, and we're the glorious via media in the middle, and it's all over now. But it didn't work out that way. Now, we talked a little bit last time about why it didn't work out that way. One is because because the Constantinople made a renewed attempt to steal second spot in the church from Egypt, thereby reducing to vanishing point the chances of the Egyptians accepting the results of Chalcedon. But the other is that basically the Nestorians got out the ticker tape. They interpreted Chalcedon as, yay, we've won, after all, we've snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. And they sort of interpreting the word nature a little bit like the Egyptians were. They were saying, so two natures. So basically, Jesus of Nazareth is just a close personal friend of the second person of the Trinity. And the Chalcedonians, as they're known, the people loyal to the Council of Chalcedon, are like, no, that's not what we mean at all. But the people who were backing Cyril, and of course Cyril is the good guy, so I mean the Sensus Fidelium in the East is with Cyril. He's the one who's backing up that Our Lady's the Mother of God, and we like Cyril. So it's not just in Egypt, it's all through lots of regions of the East. They're looking at particularly where they're speaking Greek, because that's where the terminology about nature, physis and hypostasis and ousia is all confused. And of course in the Latin West the terminology always been very straightforward, and so that also applies to the European parts of the East, which are also Latin speaking mostly. So the ordinary Catholic, as it were, is looking at these Nestorians celebrating, and they're like, well, hang on, what's going on here? So they think the Council of Chalcedon is a disaster. So it's a little bit like, he says, treading on very dangerous ground here, but it's a little bit like after Vatican II, in the sense that people who really didn't like well, how to put this right. So there were people at Vatican II who were really dodgy, and those people managed to get some ambiguous phrases into some of the documents. But in general, or I would probably say entirely, they failed to get in anything that was just outright false into any of the documents. But what they thought was, if we put these kind of ambiguous phrases in, then afterwards, if we celebrate loudly enough about the fact that, yay, we won, then it'll become self-fulfilling. Everyone will interpret the council as being a great victory for modernists, and the people who are like, well, it is an ecumenical council, but modernism is bad, no one will pay any attention to them. They'll just see the cheering modernists over there, and all the people who hate modernists and don't have the time to pore through documents and make lots of distinctions will look at the cheering modernists and lose it. So basically, that's what happened after Vatican II. Is that people are saying, well, technically there isn't a problem here if you can distinguish this term from this term, but nobody's paying any attention to them, because all they can see is the cheering modernists saying Jesus isn't God anymore, and you can marry blokes even if you're a bloke. They're like, and then the people who are like the ordinary pious Catholics who've been brought up rightly to be very hostile to modernists assume that if the modernists are cheering that loudly, there must be a very serious problem here. So very similar with Chalcedon. So the Nestorians start cheering it as a victory, and the Egyptians, who are already predisposed to be very annoyed about the council, any chance that they might accept it is completely lost, and they're absolutely furious. And also ordinary pious people who were on Cyril's side and hostile to Nestorianism in other parts of the Eastern Empire, they also are furious. So in the decades following Chalcedon, it degenerates into chaos. You often have people being elected to different dioceses in the East who are overtly rejecting the Council of Chalcedon, and then in some dioceses where there happens to be a following for Nestorius, or at least for the Antiochian school of theology, of which he is a particularly bad example, we're going for people who, usually they weren't actually endorsing Nestorius, because I mean Chalcedon had actually condemned Nestorius, so as well as Ephesus, condemning Nestorius. But at least they didn't. That even if they weren't actually endorsing Nestorius, they weren't condemning him, or if they were, it's through gritted teeth. And they were very keen on all the theologians that Nestorius was very keen on, and so everybody was kind of, everybody was it was a bad sign. And so the Roman emperors started to freak out about this, because in the ancient world, it's hard for us to understand this, but in the ancient world, they had a much more vivid sense of the necessity of keeping God or the gods happy. So the reason why there'd been the brutal persecution of the Christians in the first place before Constantine converted is because it was thought that the gods are going to be very annoyed about these lunatics going around saying there's only one God and he's a guy from Judea in the first century. They were sometimes less annoyed about the Jews, because they thought, well, the Jews are following their ancestral religion of their particular god, and okay, they think he's the only god, and that's really irritating, so you wouldn't want to have them at dinner parties because they'd offend everybody. They'd refuse to eat most of the food anyway, but at least they're following their ancestral religion, so so long as they don't try and rebel and seize control of the temple again, then we'll just ignore them and let them get on with it, right? So that was the attitude to the Jews. But the Christians were going around trying to persuade people to give up on their ancestral religions, worshipping Mercury or Tutatis or whoever it might happen to be, and start worshipping Jesus of Nazareth as the one true God. And so that was going to annoy Mercury and Tutatis and Isis and whoever else demon they thought was a god that they were worshipping. So they thought, that's going to ruin the empire. Because if the gods are incredibly angry with the empire, then it's going to ruin the empire. So there's nothing for it. We're going to have to kill all these Christians. So that was in order to keep the gods happy. So that was the rationale behind the original persecution. And then, of course, so when Constantine converts, he converts because he realizes Jesus of Nazareth is the one true God, and so actual victory and the prosperity of the empire comes with Jesus of Nazareth. So the idea. So once things start to go a bit wrong with the Rhine freezing and the Goths pouring in, all that kind of thing, they think, well, we must be doing something wrong here. So obviously the pagans, the remaining pagans, they're like, yeah, you're doing something wrong. You should be worshipping the pagan gods. It's not rocket science. But obviously most people didn't think that. But enough people thought that Saint Augustine wrote the City of God. So the City of God is designed to refute the pagans who. His biggest work, it's a masterpiece. But it's like climbing a mountain. But you got to read it. But yes. So he wrote that to say, no, don't be ridiculous, paganism. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. So if we're going to exclude the idea that it's because we should have remained pagans, well, then the explanation for why things are going completely horribly wrong might well be that we're not squishing the heretics as vigorously as we should be, right? So the Roman emperors were very worried about the fact that people didn't agree as to what the true doctrine was, and weren't, and only about half of the population of the remaining bit of the empire that they still controlled were accepting the Council of Chalcedon. And now later on, it gets worse and ingrained, and it becomes a kind of nationalisty thing. Now initially it's not at all. It's definitely theological. There's hurt national feelings in Egypt, but elsewhere there are lots of people who don't approve of the Council of Chalcedon, and they're not disapproving for nationalist reasons. But as the situation doesn't get resolved over successive centuries, over about 100 years really, it begins to become that people who speak Greek, which is the sort of common language of the eastern half of the empire, and they are much more inclined to accept Chalcedon and be loyal to the Roman government. But people who speak the local languages, so people who speak Coptic in Egypt or speak Aramaic in Syria or whatever, they start to be the ones who reject Chalcedon. So it becomes a kind of nationalistic, ethnic thing, and therefore becomes even more a problem. It becomes a huge security problem for the Roman emperors. But initially, they were more concerned about the theological question itself and how backing the wrong horse on that question, or allowing a large chunk of the population to back the wrong horse on that question, was going to offend God. But it starts to, as it sinks into the soil, as it were, it becomes entangled more and more with ethnic and national questions, and that's going to become a big problem when we get to Constantinople III. But so eventually, what happens is the Emperor Zeno, the one who was sent the regalia of the now abolished Western Roman Emperor, he gets deposed in a coup by a rival emperor who manages to hold on for a couple of years, and he decides to try and introduce Monophysitism again, and he says to the bishops of the Eastern Empire, right, one nature in Christ, we'll forget about all this Chalcedon stuff, and then something happens which is a recurring problem, which is that all the Eastern bishops immediately say, oh yeah, fine, where do we sign? Okay, that's great. Yep, Monophysitism, great. We take Chalcedon, and and of course, I mean, this isn't just a problem with people who speak Greek. I mean, I hate to break this to you, but there are quite a few time servers among the clergy, and some of them are, more than one would like to hope, are looking to see which way the wind is blowing, so that they can jump in that direction as fast as possible. So he only manages to last a year or two, and Zeno gets back in there in 482, but Zeno's a bit shocked about how quickly everything turned round, and so he thinks, well, I need to do something about this. I mean, the situation is it's shown how unstable it is, the fact that this could happen. So he begins this horrendous process, which is going to go on for centuries after this, of emperors trying to come up with dodgy theological compromises in order to solve the problem, the row over the Council of Chalcedon. So he creates this document called the Henotikon, in discussion with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's called Acacius. Whether we should call him Patriarch or not. Well, I'll just say, imagine the until the 9th century, there are speech marks around the word Patriarch. So anyway, so the Patriarch of Constantinople, Acacius, him and Zeno, they get together and they come up with this sort of ecumenical joint statement thing called the Henotikon, and it basically it drops all reference to one person in two natures, and goes back to one person from two natures without commenting on whether he's in two natures, and it condemns any which is not false, right? But it's just leaving out a very important element of what the truth that was defined at Chalcedon, and it condemns any heretics, whether at Chalcedon or anywhere else, right? Now this is the real killer line, right? Because it's basically, it doesn't say anything about Chalcedon other than this one line, and it doesn't mention anything about Pope Leo in his tome, which had been acclaimed as spoken by St. Peter through Leo at Chalcedon, and which, as far as the West was concerned, was the absolute last word on the question. So it doesn't say anything about them. It doesn't condemn them, but it doesn't make any reference to them. And then it says, and we condemn all heretics, whether at Chalcedon or anywhere else. So it doesn't say that the Council of Chalcedon is heretical, and it doesn't even say that there were heretics at the Council of Chalcedon. I'm sure there were. There are very few bars in the world that there's no heretic in. But it's condemned heretics whether at Chalcedon or anywhere else. So it's clearly deliberately insinuating that there probably were. You and I know, we're not going to say it because this is supposed to be an ecumenical document, but you and I know that there were, but we're not saying it. We're just saying that if there were, then we condemn them. And so they think this is really clever. So this will allow the people who reject Chalcedon to agree, go back to the to the agreement that they had before. Remember when John of Antioch makes friends with Cyril of Alexandria. So it's going back to kind of that agreement. And of course now, if you remember from last time, when the whole thing was over, Dioscorus and his followers actually looked at what Eutyches had said and were like, oh gosh, that's actually really terrible. So they actually condemned what Eutyches said. So they thought, well, if we hadn't said that thing about two natures at Chalcedon, then we could have been okay. So this is what Zeno and Acacius are thinking. So we'll just kind of bracket it, and nobody has to mention whether they think Chalcedon is a legitimate council or not, and we'll just all agree to go back to what was agreed in 433, but this reflects another abiding problem between the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians, which is that in general, apart from the Nestorians who are pretending that it was a big victory for them, the non-Nestorian Chalcedonians, which of course would be all Chalcedonians, in fact, they think that they don't really disagree with Dioscorus and his followers. They disagree with Eutyches, but so does Dioscorus. So they think that it's really just an argument over words that has no real content, whereas the non-Chalcedonians, they can't admit that it's just an argument over words, because that would sort of, they would then be convicted of having devastated the church theologically just for the sake of vanity. So they have to insist that it's a real substantial disagreement. But of course that makes it really difficult to resolve, because it isn't a real substantial disagreement. So you can't get down to the point where you can resolve the question, because there isn't really a question to resolve when you it's just purely terminological. But the non-Chalcedonians can't admit that. But in the meantime, the Chalcedonians are burdened with these annoying Nestorians jumping up and down and cheering, who they really desperately need to get rid of. And now this is made worse by the fact that the Nestorians, a number of the people who were associated with Nestorius and may or may not have been complicit in his errors, had been acquitted at the Council of Chalcedon. So one of the things that these difficult questions around these two councils point to, which is helpful for our times, is it shows the limits of papal and conciliar infallibility, the sort of stuff that councils are infallible about and the sorts of stuff that they aren't infallible about. So people have a tendency, both with councils and with popes, to think, well, the Pope's infallible, so if he likes Stargate, I've got to like Stargate too, and Vatican II is infallible, at least when it chooses to say something definitive, and therefore, if the fathers of Vatican II really like Babylon 5, I have to like Babylon 5. But no, you really don't. Their taste in pasta, science fiction series, and football teams are not relevant to their right. So even if they discussed it at the council, unless they actually taught it, then it's not relevant. But people aren't making that distinction at the time, right? So there's three people particularly. There's a guy called Theodora of Mopsuestia, who was long dead before the council.
He's long dead now.
He's long dead now as well, yes. But he was long dead by the time Chalcedon happened. But he was a sort of theological rock star of the Antiochian tradition. So he was revered by Nestorius and all of Nestorius's pals. And he had not been condemned at Chalcedon. Actually, Chalcedon didn't say anything about him, really. But there were two others who were also followers of Theodore, as Nestorius was, who had been condemned at the Latrocinium, at the fake Second Council of Ephesus, and who turned up to try and get vindicated at Chalcedon. So these were Theodoret of Cyrus and Ebas of Edessa. Right, so it's going to be difficult to remember all this. But anyway, so the three problematic cheering Nestorians, one of whom admittedly is dead, or near miss Nestorians, or whatever they are Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Ebas of Edessa. And Theodoret of Cyrus and Ebas of Edessa are still alive at the Council of Chalcedon. And the Council of Chalcedon, and they've been condemned and deposed by the pseudo Second Council of Ephesus. So Chalcedon has to decide what to do about them. Now, Chalcedon is on a bit of it's sort of getting excited. We're resolving everything here. We've deposed Dioscorus. We hate that Second Council of Ephesus, the robber council, etc. And so these two guys turn up and they say, we were deposed at the Second Council of Ephesus. It's not fair. And Chalcedon's like, we don't like the Second Council of Ephesus. We're going to restore you. And so they're restored to their sees. But they shouldn't have done that, because they were, if they weren't Nestorians, they were very close to Nestorians, and they'd written very rude things about Cyril of Alexandria, and they refused to condemn Nestorius on various occasions, and they sort of given promises to condemn Nestorius and then not really done it. And so they were the principal cheerleaders. You know, they were like the dodgy German theologians of Vatican II. They were the principal cheerleaders among the Nestorians, going, "Yay, Chalcedon, victory for us!" who were causing the problem. So the Chalcedonians really need to get rid of them. But in the meantime, and that was slowly being realized by the Orthodox Chalcedonians, were realizing that they were burdened by these near-miss semi-Nestorians or actual Nestorians, and they need to make it clear that they were not okay. But the problem was that they'd been kind of acquitted by Chalcedon. Now a council's failure to condemn someone is not actually a canonization of their theology or their writings. It's just a prudential decision on the part of the council. But people aren't making distinctions like that at the time. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, there was a more pressing problem, which is that the Pope the popes, for several popes in Rome, including Gregory the Great's granddad, Felix III. They were like furious about this Henotikon, and furious about what Acacius had done, and so they excommunicated Acacius, and with him all the bishops who agreed to this ecumenical joint statement, the Henotikon. So the entire Eastern Roman Empire was excommunicated by the popes, and in earlier and later times, the emperors would have just lost it and sent some troops in to bully the Pope. But they couldn't do that, because the Pope was being ruled by the Ostrogoths. So they couldn't get there to get at him. And in fact, Theodoric, the ruler of the Ostrogoths, he thought, well, actually, it's quite good for me if the Pope is in schism with the chaps in the East, because that will stop the Romans in Italy getting all nostalgic about the Emperor and thinking about getting together a GoFundMe page to arrange for a new navy, so that the Eastern Romans can come and free them from the Goths. So the Goths were keen to protect the popes from any reprisals from the emperor in Constantinople for refusing to accept his ecumenical initiative, and the popes were kind of like the senators who were getting all excited about being able to play politician again after centuries of not really having any power. So the popes were also like, we can say what we like and they can't touch us. So the popes were hurling condemnations across the Mediterranean at Constantinople, and Constantinople couldn't do anything about it. And it reminds me of my brother-in-law, who's an Aberdeen football fan, and Aberdeen fans really don't like Rangers, which is the Protestant team in Glasgow. And he was at a Rangers Aberdeen match, and it was after the match. I think I don't know whether Aberdeen had won or it was a draw, but it certainly had not been good for Rangers. And he was with a bunch of other Aberdeen fans, and they were jeering at the Rangers supporters. And there was a kind of police cordon between the two of them, so the Rangers supporters couldn't do anything about it. And then, to my brother-in-law's horror, he looked around and saw that all the Aberdeen fans had left, apart from him. And the police cordon was now disappearing, and there was this horde of Rangers fans there. So it was a bit like that with the popes. They were kind of like, yeah, Constantinople. But the police cordon is going to disappear eventually, but we'll get to that. So this Acacian Schism, it's called, and it's interesting because it led to a number of things. Led to sort of filling out of the concept of what Christian society should be like at the time, because there was now kind of one emperor, and Theodoric bought into this franchise idea. He writes to the Emperor Anastasius, who's one of the later emperors in this period of the Acacian Schism, and he says, he's describing the franchise theory. He says he's accepting it. He says, our monarchy is an imitation of yours, a copy of the only empire on earth. Right. So this is the theory that the Christian emperor, the emperor in Constantinople, should be like the leader of the Christian world, the head of the laity, and the popes kind of accept this as well. They just think that he's a naughty boy at the moment. He needs to get his theology sorted out. So at the same time, Pope Gelasius, who's the pope in the 90s of the 5th century, he writes to Anastasius, and he kind of lays a very famous letter, normally called Duo sunt tu there are, because that's the first line of the first phrase in the famous paragraph where he lays out the theory of the relationship between the spiritual power, the hierarchy, and the temporal ruler in a Christian society. And also whereas for centuries the Roman Empire had slipped from being kind of a theoretically civilian regime in which, at least in theory, the emperor was appointed by the Senate and the people, to being a sort of out-and-out military dictatorship, that had sort of began to change at the same period. And Anastasius, this emperor, was an important instance of that, because because Constantinople was such a brilliant location for a city, with these completely impenetrable walls surrounded on 3 sides by water, with its own special deep water port which you couldn't get to from the outside, so you could have a whole navy just sort of waiting there to be deployed whenever you wanted to. So it was like the perfect capital city. And but one of the consequences of that is that it never really falls to external siege until 1204 at the earliest, and even then they had help on the inside. So in some ways, really 1453 when it gets destroyed by the Turks. So I mean, that's pretty amazing. This is like, and it's in an exposed position, and yet it's brilliantly located so that you can't take it. So one of the big impacts of that is that you can't have a military coup so easily, because the armies they can't get in. So the emperors become much more genuinely acclaimed by the people in the city of Constantinople. So there's this interesting transformation and kind of transformation of the Christian empire, even though they're naughty Christians who are in schism from the Pope at this point. But anyway, so eventually in 518, the Emperor Anastasius dies, and he is succeeded by Justin. Now, Justin is a Latin who comes from the European parts of the Eastern Empire. He comes from what would now be the Republic of Northern Macedonia, I think it's now called. Recent agreement with the Greeks as to what it's going to be called. And he's from a very humble background. He's actually illiterate, but he's the head of the imperial bodyguard, and he manages to get himself in there as emperor. And he's quite old at this point. He has a very bright nephew, his real name is Peter Sabatius, but that doesn't sound posh enough. And he was actually a sort of goat herd or something when he was a kid, because him and his uncle come from very humble background. But his uncle made it up to the top of the imperial guard, and then through a kind of fluke of politics, ends up as mostly stage managed fluke by the clever nephew, ends up as the emperor. And so the clever nephew decides Peter Sabatius is just not posh enough, so he changed his name to Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus, which sounds a lot more kind of, you might think of me for emperor with a name like that. But him and his uncle are both Latins, and they don't like this schism. They think people should shut up and do what the Pope says. Justinian, as he's usually known, Petrus Sabatius. Justinian means the kind of the one of Justin, so basically just means Justin's nephew. So Justinian, he is very ambitious, and he wants to reconquer all these lost Western provinces. So he's very committed to the idea winning round the Pope and ending this schism, and he wants, unlike the Theodoric the Ostrogoth in Italy, he wants the Romans in Italy to be pining for the emperor and plotting his return. So if they're going to be doing that, he needs to end the schism, because if they're thinking, well, we'd like the emperor to come back, but he's a nasty heretic, so we're probably best that he's on the other side of the Adriatic and we can forget about him. So he wants all that has to go. So he needs to reconcile with the Pope. So him and his uncle get together, and they decide on immediate reconciliation. So they contact the Pope, who at this time is called Hormazdus, exciting papal name, Persian family background. And he basically says, I'm bringing them all back in. You know what they're like. I'll tell them, and they'll capitulate straight away. So we want to end the schism, and you can impose any terms you like. And I'll make sure that they jolly well submit to them. And so Hormazdus is like, yes, absolutely. So they get together this thing called the Formula of Hormazdus, which is a kind of excruciatingly embarrassing for the Greek Orthodox nowadays. It was very explicit about the sublime and untainted faith of the Roman See that has never been prevailed against, etc. And he says, and I don't just want, not only are you submitting to the doctrine of the Council of Chalcedon, but I also want you to rub out from your commemoration of the dead all of those patriarchs of Constantinople who were in place during the schism, there to be forgotten about, left to the flames in which they now dwell, and then this oath which we've written. You're going to make every bishop in the entire Eastern Empire sign this, and I want copies in duplicate. So they really they see their moment and they go for it. So the popes are kind of, that's great. But on the other side, Justinian is he's married to this woman called Theodora. And she is also from a really, really humble background. And it's not clear how dodgy her past is. She seems to have been the mistress of the governor of Libya at some point, and then he got bored of her. And this was before she met Justinian. And then she things went badly for her, and she ended up as an actress. And it's not clear how much of an actual actress she was, and how much of a courtesan or a prostitute she was. And one of the problems with this period is that there's this sort of official court historian called Procopius who wrote major histories of the period, which is really handy. But he actually, in which he goes on about how marvelous Justinian, because obviously, as you will have guessed, eventually in 527 Justinian succeeds his uncle and becomes emperor. So the official court histories of this guy Procopius are all about how marvelous Justinian is. But he really, actually, Procopius hated Justinian, and he hated Theodora, his wife, and he hated Justinian's best general, and he hated Justinian's best general's wife as well. So while he was writing these histories about the glorious achievements of Justinian, which were quite glorious, he also wrote what's called the Secret History, which is a kind of excruciating expose. It's absolutely lurid. I mean, don't let your kids get hold of it. I mean, it describes the unbelievable sort of sexual immorality and all sorts of other terrible allegations. He sort of basically outright says that Justinian was possessed at various points, but he left it kind of locked up in a box, ready to be discovered after he died, so that he couldn't get into trouble for it. But that also means no one can sue. So whether or not these lurid, horrendous allegations against Justinian and Theodora are true or not, no one's ever really going to know, which is a bit naughty on Procopius's part. But I mean, one understands that offending the ruler of the known world can be dangerous. But anyway, she apparently had a very dodgy lifestyle. But during the time of her greatest poverty, apparently she was in Egypt, and the Monophysites had kind of taken pity on her and looked after her, and as a result, Theodora was a really zealous Monophysite and rejecter of the Council of Chalcedon. But she was a real force of nature, and Justinian thought she was amazing. And he actually got Justin to change the law to allow the nephew of the emperor to marry somebody from a very, very, very common background, so that he could marry Theodora, and he thought she was just amazing. So, but it actually helped him, and she had like a absolutely steel will, and famously in 532. After Justinian had become emperor, there were these massive riots called the Nika riots, which were a bit like the Scottish football. There were huge riots between rival chariot supporters. There were the Greens and the Blues, who supported different teams in the Hippodrome in Constantinople. And it sounds ridiculous, but they made a huge impact on world history, really, because they were often, bringing down emperors and things like that. But they, one reason or another, it took too long to explain. They'd both been offended. They'd both been offended by Justinian, and they were experienced rioters, and so they combined their forces and turned on Justinian, and the whole of Constantinople was set ablaze. And Justinian basically had a kind of escape barge ready to just kind of go and flee and go and live somewhere in Italy or something, and just forget about it. And I used to be emperor, and now I live in this little villa, but it's okay, I'm still alive. And Theodora famously says, what are you doing, you pathetic man? And she famously said, purple is the best shroud, meaning I will die an empress, and I'll either die an empress in my bed, or I'll be torn limb from limb by this crowd, but I'm not going to die in a villa in Italy living in exile. And it's like Hillary. Well, that's a bit unfair on all people. But anyway, so Justinian grows a spine back, and he massacres the rioters, and so it's a funny position, because Justinian he's him and his uncle, they've restored unity with the Pope, and they've restored the Chalcedonian position, and they're Latins, and in fact Pope John I comes and visits Constantinople, and it's really when Justin is still emperor, and the whole population of Constantinople go out and meet him at the 12th milepost, and the emperor, Justin, prostrates himself in front of Pope John. So it's really dramatic stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't think any Western emperor in later history ever did this. and then John is sort of cheered into Constantinople, and they let him celebrate the Roman Rite in Latin in the Hagia Sophia, the Cathedral of Constantinople, on Easter Sunday, and he crowns Justin on Easter Sunday. So it's like amazing stuff. This is Gelasius when he wrote his thing about the proper relationship between the spiritual being above the temporal power. This is exactly the sort of thing he had in mind. He would have been delighted. And so on the one hand, Justin and his regime, dating back to his uncle, Justinian and his regime dates back to his uncle, is very much associated with Chalcedonianism and the Latins and being loyal to the Pope. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, his wife is a notoriously committed Monophysite. So Justinian is in a kind of is in an ideal situation to try and resolve the problem, because he's got the sympathy of the Monophysites to some extent, because they know that he's madly in love with a Monophysite woman, and on the other hand, he's got the sympathy of the Latins and the Chalcedonians because of his own background and convictions. And he's also quite highly educated, because his uncle, as soon as he started to rise in the imperial service, made sure that the nephew got a good education, whereas Justin remained illiterate to the end of his days. So he's got a lot of theological ideas of his own. So he wants to resolve and like most Chalcedonians, he thinks that it's really that there isn't a substantial disagreement here. What's going on is it's a disagreement over words. So Justinian tries to have Justinian, you've got to understand this, he's very committed to the idea of being a really amazing Roman emperor. So he ticks every single box. So he builds the largest church in the entire world, because he has to rebuild the Hagia Sophia because it gets burnt down during the Nika riots. They're called Nika, right? So, like Nike, the sports brand, means victory, right? So that's what the chariot fans used to shout in the arena when in the hippodrome during the races, and they used that as their kind of as their cheer when they were trying to kill Justinian. But as I say, in the end, they lost. So they burnt down the Hagia Sophia. So Justinian rebuilt it. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of but the Hagia Sophia. It was the largest covered space on earth until the 11th century, and it's absolutely amazing building. It's a very famous cultural historian convert to.
I've seen the photos of the new one. I thought you were going to ask the photos of the original one. I'm going, I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. So the current one that's now been turned into a mosque, alas, since 1453. But it was the largest church in Christendom, the largest covered space on earth, and it's just an amazing building. And Justinian does, spoiler, manage to reconquer big chunks of the Western Empire, and he also saves Roman law, because the whole structure of Roman law is kind of falling apart, because there is no, the world is overrun by barbarians, and the kind of the basis on which it was, social basis on which it was established, is falling apart. So Justinian has it all codified into a single, easy to use system. Which becomes the classic sort of text of Roman law that goes down to later centuries. So he codifies the law, he builds the biggest church in the world, he wins lots of victories and conquers all this stuff back. So the fourth box he needs to tick is to hold a triumphant ecumenical council. That's what you have to do as a Roman emperor. So Steve, if you ever happen to become a Roman emperor, remember the four things: conquer lots of provinces, hold an ecumenical council, build the largest church in the entire world, and issue lots of laws.
Dear diary.
So he begins, particularly after the riots, when he's the king of the ashes. So he wants to kind of restore his reputation. And so not only does he begin this big building program, but he gets his generals to start plotting the reconquest of the West, and he succeeds. He sends an army to North Africa, which has been ruled by the Vandals for 100+ years, and with amazing rapidity they reconquer it. And his greatest general, Belisarius, has this huge Roman triumph in Constantinople, and they drag the Vandal king behind his chariot, and then they throw him in the dust in front of Justinian in his balcony in the hippodrome. So like, the Romans are back. All that Gothic stuff was a blip. And so then they launched the reconquest of Gothic Italy. Now, Gothic Italy is in a state of a terrible condition by this point, because the ending of the schism with the Pope has meant that, as mentioned, the Romans in Italy are like, yes, we want the emperor back. Yes, this is good. We like this guy. He's our guy. He speaks Latin as his first language. He understands what it's all about. So Theodoric, who had been getting on really well with the Italians, now becomes completely paranoid. And in fact, the reason Pope John was there for this amazing trip to Constantinople is because Justin had issued a law saying that no one who was a heretic, including, of course, Arians, could hold office anywhere in the Roman Empire. Now, officially, Theodoric is supposed to be ruling Italy because he's got a piece of paper from the emperor. So this law is completely undermining his authority. And so Theodoric is absolutely furious. And so he sends Pope John across to Constantinople to try and get these laws repealed. And in fact, Justin is quite easygoing about this, and largely does agree to repeal them, with most of their effect for Italy anyway, in order to make, because of the particular difficult situation there. But he doesn't. One of Theodoric's demands was that people who had since the laws were passed converted from Arianism back to Catholicism should be allowed to return to being Arians, and that was too much for the emperor. He's like, no, we're not having that. So Pope John comes back with most of the demands met, but Theodoric's just become degenerated into crazy paranoia by this point. So he locks up Pope John in prison, where he dies, obviously, which goes down like a lead balloon with the Romans in Italy. So it completely ruins the relationship between the Romans in Italy, and also the great martyr, philosopher, theologian, and statesman Boethius, who we mentioned last time, who solved lots of theological problems, he had been sort of chief minister to Theodoric, and Theodoric was fine about the fact that he was a militant Catholic, but now he was paranoid about militant Catholics. So Boethius is dragged off into prison and eventually clubbed to death. And he was planning to translate the complete works of Aristotle, complete works of Plato into Latin with accompanying commentary, concluding with a grand synthesis of all philosophy and theology. So basically he was planning to do like the life's work of Thomas Aquinas plus all of the translators of the 12th century in his own lifetime. And that was all kind of rather dramatically reduced by the fact he was waiting to be clubbed to death. So instead he wrote the masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy, all about the nature of suffering and evil and how that's compatible with divine providence. Wonderful book, but somewhat smaller than the Opera Omnia of Thomas Aquinas, which is more what Boethius was planning to write. So things are really bad in Gothic Italy. So anyway, Theodoric dies in his bed, and then there's a sort of succession crisis, and Justinian's like, great, succession crisis, that's exactly the kind of thing we need here. So he sends in his armies led up by Belisarius into Italy. Now, eventually, Belisarius reaches and conquers Rome on the 9th of December 536. Now you've got to follow me here, right? So just before he gets to just before the Italian campaign of the Emperor in Constantinople, of Justinian, to reconquer Italy, really gets underway, when the Romans had reconquered Sicily but not mainland Italy. The then king of the Goths didn't last very long because there were lots of arguments among them. He's like, we need to make sure we have a pro-Gothic pope in there as soon as possible, because that's what maintains relations. And so he gets this guy Simplicius in as pope, so when Belisarius arrives, there's a bit of tension between Belisarius and the newly arrived Romans and the Pope, because the Pope is definitely a kind of Gothic candidate, and they're not completely happy with they're not completely happy with sure about his loyalty to the regime in Constantinople. Now, but Simplicius is entirely friendly about the whole thing, but he accepts Belisarius, and that's fine. But the campaign doesn't go quite as easily as it did in North Africa, and the Goths are soon besieging Rome again. And so Belisarius is hauled up in Rome with the Pope, being besieged by the Goths, and it's the Pope that the Goths had installed before the Romans got there. So there's a lot of tension building up there. Now, in the meantime, there's been tension between the popes and Justinian, because Justinian has held these discussions in Constantinople to try and reconcile the Monophysites, and he manages to get a few Monophysite bishops in there, and they have these discussions about the question. And the problem is that in the end, the Monophysites, because there isn't really a genuine substantive problem down there, and especially because Justinian is willing to condemn those three Nestorian or semi-Nestorian theologians. He sees part of the solution to this is to condemn those guys who were acquitted at Chalcedon. Mm-hmm. He wants to find some way, or they're dead now, but he wants to find some way of condemning them, which won't cast the authority of the Council of Chalcedon into disrepute, but which will reassure the Monophysites that the Chalcedonians are not secret Nestorians. So that kind of comes out of the meeting, that if that were done, and this ends up being called the three chapters dispute, because by chapters they mean extracts from the writings of these three guys. Mm-hmm. And what Justinian wants, and what the Monophysites would definitely like to see happen, albeit they're not promising that they're going to reunite if it does happen, but what the Monophysites would like to see happen is that for these writings of these three theologians to be condemned posthumously, and Justinian's kind of up for that, and he's also up for going as far as you possibly can without repudiating Chalcedon in using the kind of language that St. Cyril used. So he's willing to actually use the expression, the one incarnate nature of the divine logos, right? And so long as it's explained that doesn't contradict what Chalcedon was saying, and it's because the term nature is being used in a different way, he's willing to use that as a kind of official Catholic expression that's okay, so long as you understand that doesn't mean that Christ doesn't have two natures. And he wants to use he wants to up the we talked last time about the communication of idioms, things like God bled on the tree and all that kind of thing. So he wants to emphasize that the 12 anathemas of Cyril are a key part of Catholic orthodoxy, and he wants to say things like one of the Holy Trinity died on the cross, and these are things which are unacceptable to the followers of Theodoret and Theodora of Mopsuestia and Abius of Edessa, right? So he's emphasizing that Chalcedon is a way of regularizing the terminology. It's nothing to do with giving into the Nestorians, and but they don't. The Monophysites don't actually agree. They kind of say, they're willing to take the concessions, but they're not willing to sign on the dotted line. And the Patriarch of Constantinople starts to sort of wobble a bit and becomes quite impressed with some of the doctrine of the Monophysites, and so Rome has ended up in a dispute over the status of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and annoying Theodora, the Emperor's wife, who we've spoken about, and so it's not clear exactly what happens in the besieged Rome. It's not clear whether or not it really is that the Pope is secretly conniving with the Goths, or whether it's really that he's not seen as sufficiently pliant to the ecumenical ambitions of Justinian. But he gets accused of plotting with the Goths, and he is deposed, and he's then taken away into exile to Asia Minor, to actually the hometown of Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus. He's taken off there, but the local bishop there is a bit unhappy when he meets the deposed Pope. He says he thinks that he's been badly treated and he hadn't actually done anything wrong, and he starts to appeal to Constantinople, which is nearby, to say, this needs to be, something needs to be done about this. This guy's been unfairly treated. So the emperor is like, oh no, this is becoming a liability. So he's sent off, the poor deposed Pope Simplicius is sent off to a tiny island in the Tyrrhenian Sea on the other side of Italy. That, like, there's almost nothing on this island, and he's basically left there to starve to death. So within a year, the whether he is the Pope or he isn't the Pope, he is at this point he's starved to death. Now, in the meantime, the papal ambassador to Constantinople, who's called Vigilius, who gets on very nicely with Theodora, is sent by Justinian back to Rome to replace this deposed pope. And he gets to Rome, and he is elected as pope. So this is a cause of difficulty and controversy in subsequent years, because he's elected pope while poor old Simplicius is still alive and is being kind of bussed around the Mediterranean to find a sufficiently barren rock for him to die on. So the Vigilius is seen as a bit shabby, as a bit of a sort of government stooge, and not having done anything about the horrible fate of his predecessor. So he's now installed as Pope in Rome, and we have to hold that he was the Pope, because otherwise it would undermine papal succession. So I mean, this happens actually quite a lot in papal history, that popes often acquiesce in their deposition, even if they're not happy about it, in order to allow the Roman Church to elect somebody else, because otherwise you end up with a kind of weird situation where you've got to try and work out whether the Pope's dead or not, and he's thousands of miles away, and you don't know what to do about electing a new Pope. So a lot of popes in papal history have acquiesced in their depositions, but it certainly casts a shadow over the appointment of Pope Vigilius. So, but the problem is, although by 340 Belisarius has completed the conquest of Italy. The following year, in 341, an absolutely terrible plague descends on the Mediterranean. It's called the Plague of Justinian, and it's like the Black Death in the 14th century. Huge numbers of people die, some vast percentage of the population of the Mediterranean, and it really undermines Justinian's reconquest. And Justinian had bought, essentially with huge amounts of gold, a perpetual peace treaty with the Persians before he launched his reconquest, in order to ensure that he wasn't getting stabbed in the back while he's turning his attention to the Persians. Turning his attention to the Ostrogoths rather. But once this huge plague descends, it's just too much for the Persians. They're like, I know, only 10 years ago we signed a treaty of perpetual peace and promised in exchange for huge sums of money that we were never going to be nasty to the Romans and invade them and stuff. But look at them, they're all dying in the streets. This is just such a wonderful opportunity. How can we possibly not take it? And so the Persians declare war on the Roman Empire again, and at the same time the Romans are all dying of this plague. And so in the end it takes decades to reconquer Italy, and huge numbers of people die, and everyone's thoroughly miserable about it. And by the end of it, the Italians are like, well, was that really worth it? Because the peninsula is completely devastated, and Rome gets besieged 3 different times. And it's not fun being besieged, because you're being starved to death, and it's pretty horrible, and it gets nasty at the end if they get in. And so Vigilius is not best liked by the Roman population anyway, because he's involved in the shady deposition of his predecessor, and his population are also, he's very strongly associated with the government, and they were sort of initially ready to hang out the ticker tape and the flags for the arrival of the legions, such as they are from the east. But now they're thoroughly fed up of them, and they're not, there's a grain problem. They're not getting enough food, and so Vigilius is beginning to feel very uncomfortable, and at the same time. Justinian is beginning to panic, because he's got a bit frustrated with the Monophysites, and he started trying to make sure that everybody who holds the major sees is definitely a Chalcedonian, and so when he eventually holds his council to try and resolve everything, the votes are going to go the right way. So he deposes Theodosius, the patriarch of Alexandria, for not being a Chalcedonian, and this deposed patriarch of Alexandria sneaks off to Thrace, so that's the area just beyond Constantinople in Europe, sort of Bulgaria sort of area, as it would be later. And he ordains this guy Jacob as a sort of wandering bishop. This is in I think this is in is in 542, if I remember rightly. So his job is to go and create a parallel Monophysite hierarchy. Right now, that's a big problem, because up to this point, the Chalcedonians and the anti-Chalcedonians have been competing to get control of the key dioceses in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they've all been playing the same game. If you see what I mean, they want to have the emperor on their side, and they want to get as many dioceses as they possibly can, and then they want to kind of bully the Pope into accepting their position, and then it'll be game over and they will have won. That's what the anti-Chalcedonians are hoping for. They're hoping that in the end Chalcedon's going to be seen as one of these fake Arian councils that they had in the 4th century and just be forgotten about, and everyone will accept that Ephesus II was a real council and it will be over. But at this point they realise Justinian's very zeal to come up with a solution has caused them to think that it's never going to get solved, that they're never going to get the whole empire and the whole church back for their cause, so they're going to have to start a new church of their own. And of course that's really panicking Justinian, because that means that the thing is going to become absolutely institutionalized and completely insoluble. So he really wants it fixed by this point. So he takes Vigilius from Rome to Constantinople. He decides we're going to have a council, and we're going to condemn every possible Nestorian interpretation of Chalcedon. We're going to condemn these three dodgy theologians, and we're going to give the Monophysites nothing that they can possibly complain about, apart from the fact that they still have to accept that Chalcedon is a legitimate council. And so Vigilius is probably quite happy to be taken out of Rome, where he's very unpopular, and he's taken over to Constantinople, and Justinian meets up with him in private and says, "Look, this is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to condemn these three theologians that were kind of left alone by Chalcedon, and we're going to have to." We're going to have to define that it's okay to say one nature of the Word incarnate, and this is the deal, basically. And the problem is that a lot of people in the West think if these guys were acquitted by Chalcedon, they can't be condemned. Otherwise, that's basically condemning Chalcedon. But Vigilius really wants to go with this. But he's really nervous because he's already very unpopular. That lots of parts of the West are going to go into schism, and in fact, in the end, lots of parts of the West do go into schism. It's one of the very rare occasions in church history where the Latin Christians decide that the Pope has let them down, and go into schism from him. Although this hasn't happened yet. So initially, Vigilius agrees that he's going to condemn the three chapters, and this Vigilius's nephew, he's not well served here. Vigilius's nephew's come with him, but Vigilius's nephew disapproves of the condemnation of the three chapters, and Vigilius agrees quietly with Justinian that when it comes to it, he's going to condemn the three chapters. And in order to try and forestall this happening, Vigilius's nephew leaks the documents to everybody so that everyone completely loses it and starts writing to Vigilius to tell him what a lily-livered dodgy pope he is. And Vigilius freaks out and says that he was kind of coerced into doing it and he doesn't really mean it. And Justinian's absolutely furious because as far as Justinian's concerned, they agreed and it wasn't coerced. And so Justinian comes to see Vigilius in a white rage, and eventually he gets Vigilius to swear an oath in front of witnesses that when it gets to the actual council, he will condemn the three chapters. Now, there might have been a sort of procedural grounds on which Vigilius might have tried to get out of this, which is he might have tried to claim, as it happens, this isn't true, but he might have tried to claim that it's just wrong to condemn someone who's already dead. You can't convict a dead person of a criminal offence, right? So he's saying, and Vigilius is kind of whispering this, that I'd love to help you here, Justinian, but it's just not really on to condemn dead people and all that kind of thing. And but the problem with that is that 10 years earlier, that I don't know whether Justinian did this deliberately in order to get things ready for this eventuality, but there'd been a spat over some ascetical writings that were heavily influenced by Origen among certain monks, and Justinian had got the then Pope to agree to a solemn condemnation of Origen and a number of propositions taught by Origen, which were anathematized. Justinian drew them up, and the Pope agreed to them, So Origen was long dead, and the Holy See had already agreed to his condemnation. So that boat had sailed. It wasn't really possible for Vigilius to take this route. Now, of course, he could have argued, I suppose, that in fact Origen had died not in communion with the See of Rome or the See of Alexandria. So although he hadn't been condemned on those specific charges, he did die excommunicate. But it was a much shakier ground than it might have been because of this condemnation of Origen that had already occurred. So eventually in 553, the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople is convened in Constantinople, in the Hagia Sophia, and it's in the patriarchal residence attached to the Hagia Sophia, because there weren't that many. I mean, it was like 100 and something bishops, but if you put them all in the Hagia Sophia, they would have looked very small. But so they do it in the patriarchal residence next door, and things have got. And Vigilius really doesn't want to go, because he doesn't want to. He thinks he's going to be disowned by the Latins if he agrees to this, and So there's been a series of embarrassing incidents. Justinian tries to have him arrested. He's rescued by a bunch of Chalcedonian senators and ordinary people, and eventually he sort of barricades himself into the papal residence of the papal ambassador's residence in Constantinople, and then he sneaks across the Bosphorus to the church where the Council of Chalcedon had been held, and he barricades himself in there. And then eventually Justinian talks him into going back to the papal ambassadorial residence in Constantinople and staying there, but he's still basically under house arrest, and he's refusing to have anything to do with the council. And so the council begins, and they're all quite happy, because Justinian's been carefully making sure that it's his guys in all the eastern seas, and it's as with all of these early councils, there's very, very, very few Latins resident at the council at all, and so it's all his guys, and they're basically agreeing to it. So they get together these anathemas, which make it very clear. Historians sometimes call it Neo-Chalcedonianism. I mean, it makes it very clear that Chalcedon is agreeing with Cyril but using Latin terminology. It's not at all Nestorian, and they go and they canonize the three chapters. They condemn the three chapters of these three theologians, and Justinian reveals that he's got this oath tucked away that the Pope has sworn to condemn the three chapters which he's now reneging on, and so the council really loses it with the Pope, and they remove him from the diptych. So the diptych is like two bits of wax joined together with hinges that are propped up on the altar, and it's like a wax writing tablet, and you inscribe in it the names of the people you're supposed to pray for in the liturgy. So a sign that you were in schism in the ancient world was when you squished out the name of the person that you were in schism with. So that this sitting ecumenical council squishes out Pope Vigilius's name from the diptych. Now they say, and this is again sort of very post-Vatican II SSPX sort of. I mean, not that the SSPX do this, but I mean it's these kind of technical arguments type things. They say we're not excommunicating the Church of Rome, we're just no longer commemorating this particular Bishop of Rome because he's very naughty, but we're okay with the Church of Rome in general and the papacy as such, but we're very, very annoyed with Vigilius. So they remove his names from the diptych. They complete the council. They issue these anathemas, including a rather marvelous anathema of Origen, which lots of people who modern people who are enthusiastic about Origen seem to forget about. There's an anathema which lists all the worst heretics of all time, and it says, and it not only anathematizes them, but it says, if anyone does not anathematize Arius, Nestorius, Eunomius, Macedonius, and Origen, with all their wicked and false doctrines, let them be anathema. So it doesn't just anathematize them, it anathematizes anyone who doesn't anathematize them. So it's the most aggressive anathematizing canon of any ecumenical council. So yeah, it's very, very vigorous. So then as the bishops go home, and Vigilius is left there under house arrest in Constantinople, and eventually towards the end of 553 he sort of breaks down and writes a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople and says that he was probably wrong not to agree to condemn the three chapters, and actually perhaps he should have done that, and he's terribly sorry about all the fuss. And then in 554 he writes to Justinian and formally ratifies and enacts the Second Council of Constantinople. and then Justinian says, "Okay, then you can go home now to your warm reception in Italy," and so he heads off. I think it's what is it? Is it the I don't remember what day it was, but anyway, he heads off, and he gets as far as Sicily, and he's sort of dawdling a bit in Sicily because he's not looking forward to his reception when he gets home to Rome, and he dies there, and that's the end of Pope Vigilius. So it's pretty exhausting business, the Second Council of Constantinople, and it immediately causes a schism in the West. So lots of the diocese of Aquileia, which was a really big deal in those days, goes into schism from Rome, and various other parts of the West join in because they're really annoyed and they see this as an undermining of Chalcedon. But I mean, it has many sort of lessons for church history in general, because I mean it shows a number of things. It shows that the fact that there were people at Chalcedon who made rash decisions about approving of certain theologians just because they were on the other side of an argument, and even went so far as to decide not to condemn their writings, doesn't demonstrate that those theologians are orthodox, because you'll get all sorts of people nowadays. They'll say this theoretical opinion in theological schools was held by respectable writers for many centuries, so if you say that there's something wrong with it, then that means that you're undermining the authority of the church. But clearly that's not true because of the Second Council of Constantinople, and you'll get people who will say, well this was clearly the prudential decision of this council, and therefore it must be right. No, because the prudential decisions of Chalcedon were infallibly reversed. They weren't infallible decisions of Chalcedon, but the dogmatic, infallible decisions of Constantinople too overthrew those prudential decisions of Chalcedon. We must always, work with the mind of the reigning pope and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying that you should abduct popes and leave them to starve to death on islands in the Tyrrhenian Sea, or put them under house arrest in Constantinople. Those are very shady activities.
Oh, put that at the bottom.
But clearly, these are infallible dogmatic definitions of an ecumenical council, and the Pope was opposed to them all the way through that council, and in the end they were ratified and solemnly defined. And also, another lesson which is very important is just because the baddies are cheering about something doesn't excuse you from reading the small print and making sure as whether or not the baddies' interpretation of it is absolutely, even if some of the baddies were at the council. You see what I mean? So I mean, I'm not saying you can't just map Chalcedon or Constantinople II onto the controversy surrounding Vatican II. That would be banal and ridiculous. Yeah. But it's just a warning that one should hang fire and look at these things carefully and not allow the personal associations, like poor old Athanasius found out with Apollinaris. The fact that he was on his side against the Arians didn't mean he wasn't dodgy on other questions, right? And it didn't mean he didn't need to be condemned in the end. So, and also, the lay role in the church, this Justinian was definitely getting heavy-handed here, but in the end, the stuff that was solemnly defined was his opinions, not Vigilius's opinions, and not some of these other opinions of people in the West that were solemnly defined. So we shouldn't instantaneously think that the opinions of emperors are not always wrong. The emperors are not always the baddies and not always wrong. They are usually the baddies, and they are often wrong, but they're not always the baddies and they're not always wrong. And so it's also a warning against an excessively clericalist understanding of the church and the ways of providence.
So in a nutshell, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it.
That kind of thing, yes.
Nice.
Well, so Doc, I don't know, perhaps we don't quite have time to do Constantinople 3 this time.
Yeah, let's wait till next week.
Okay, sure.
Well, Doc, that was great. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.
See you around.